Hi everyone, welcome back to the History in 20 podcast. Hope we're all okay, staying safe and well and all that. So today's episode is about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a hugely influential queen in the Middle Ages. So we'll dive right in with this one because we've got quite a lot to talk about today. So start off with her personal profile. So her actual date of birth wasn't actually known. She was born sometime between 1122 and 1124. So just about, for the simplicity of this episode, I've presumed she's born in 1122. So when I reference her age, if I say she's, say, 80, I'm referring to 1202. If she's 78, I'm referring to 1200, etc. So for this episode, we'll presume she was born in 1122. And she was born in Poitiers in France. And she died on the 1st of April 1204, aged 81 to 82, depending on when she was born in that year, in Poitiers in France. Now, she had various reigns. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine from the 9th of April 1137 to the 1st of April 1204. She was the Queen Consort of France from the 1st of August 1137 to the 21st of March 1152, and she was the Queen Consort of England from the 19th of December 1154 to the 6th of July 1189. So, as you can tell from that already, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to tell that she did have a pretty exciting lifestyle. So, she was married twice to two different kings. Firstly, to Louis VII of France, whom she was married to between 1137 until its annulment in 1152, and then King Henry II of England, who we've previously discussed in another podcast, and she was married to him from 1152 until his death in 1189, and she never remarried after that. She had various children, 10 children in total, I believe, and they are listed on my blog, but yeah, go on, I'll read them out. There was Marie, who was Countess of Champagne, Alix, Countess of Blois, William IX, Count of Poitiers, Henry the Young King, Matilda, the Duchess of Saxony, Richard I, King of England, Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany, Eleanor, Queen of Castile, Joan, Queen of Sicily, and John, King of England. So quite the family tree going on there. And she was from the House of Poitiers. So a quick little introduction to her. She's obviously one of the most, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most formidable queens of the Middle Ages. And she's often unfortunately overlooked because of those contemporaries who surrounded her. So King Louis VII of France, the Crusader, King Henry II of England, the First Plantagenet, King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, and King John Lackland of England. So despite this, though, without Eleanor, none of these men would have been who they were. She married two kings from two different countries. She was mother to over 5 different kings and queens. And not only that, but she epitomised the courtly lifestyle of the High Middle Ages. There was crusading, there was chivalry, and there was even confinement. And she's not just one of the standout queens of the Middle Ages, but one of the most powerful, influential and greatest people of all time. So we'll start with her early life, which we're going from circa 1122 up to 1137. So, as is unfortunately the case with many of the medieval sources we've looked at so far at the History in 20 podcast, Eleanor's exact birth date is actually unknown, and there's actually debate about her birth year, as I mentioned earlier, sometime between 1122 and 24. Now, she was of noble birth, born to William X, who was Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor de Châtellerault, if I've pronounced that wrongly, which I probably have, someone correct me in the comments. And they were the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor was really well educated in her upbringing, actually, and that's clear to see that she used that in her later life as well. So she was thoroughly knowledgeable in a range of subjects, from literature and philosophy to languages and even the constellations of the stars. So as part of her upbringing, she was trained in courtly life, and obviously what was to be expected of a young woman in a 12th century French court. However, her father died when Eleanor was aged 15, and as she was the eldest of his 3 children, she became his heir, and thus the Duchess of Aquitaine, because her mother had unfortunately died when Eleanor was about 5. So William X had requested in his will that Eleanor therefore be placed under the guardianship of the French king, who was Louis VI at the time. He reigned from 1108 to 37, for anyone interested, and within a matter of hours she'd been betrothed to the king's son, Prince Louis. Now, Louis VI died in August 1137, and his son succeeded him as King Louis VII, who reigned from 1137 to 1180. So the next section we'll talk about is her marriage to King Louis VII of France, and their involvement in the Second Crusade. So Eleanor married Louis VII of France when she was aged about 15 in July 1137, and they were officially crowned King and Queen of France on Christmas Day 1137. So with this marriage, Eleanor almost doubled the land area subject to the Capetian house, which was the royal family of France at the time, bringing with her territories in the south and southwest of France where she was from. Now, ironically enough, Louis wasn't even meant to be king in the first place. His older brother Philip had actually fallen from his horse when he was out riding, chasing after hares, I think, and a pig ran out and freaked out the horse, and it tripped over and it sent him flying and he died, which left Louis as heir to the Capetian crown as a result. Now, this was evident in Louis's kingship and his personal life, because as a young boy, as was the tradition, Louis had been sent to Paris by his father to train for priesthood, and Eleanor famously once commented that she had married a monk, not a king. So obviously the marriage was therefore destined to be difficult from the outset. You've got Eleanor's fiery, politically astute, tempestuous demeanour, and then you've got Louis's pretty humble, pious, shy nature. And the historian Geoffrey Hindley wrote a great book on the Crusades. You'll see that in the bibliography below. He stated that she hardly fitted conventional models of domestic docility, and he was absolutely right. Now, in the early 1140s, Eleanor moved to Paris where the rulers of France sort of met and lived. And it was at this time that Eleanor's credited, this is just a bit of a miscellaneous fact, good for pub quizzes and that, this is where Eleanor's credited with being responsible for the introduction of built-in fireplaces in castles and houses and stuff, because she was obviously shocked by the frigid winters in the north of France in complete contrast to the warmer, milder winters down on the Mediterranean coast where she was from. So this innovation spread quickly, and built-in fireplaces became a staple in castles from here on in. So, fun fact for you there. Now, arguably the most major event in Louis and Eleanor's marriage was their involvement in the Second Crusade, which ran from 1147 to 50. And I'll just put this out there now. If anyone would like me to do a mini-series on the Crusades, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. Let me know in the comments below. Leave a comment and just ask what you'd like. So, anyway, back to this. So under almost pretty much direct instruction from Pope Eugene III, Eleanor accompanied Louis, or what was more likely, Louis accompanied Eleanor, on the way to Jerusalem to liberate the, inverted commas, Christian city from the infidel, which were Muslims, who'd taken it over. So Eleanor and Louis arrived in Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey, and on the 11th of March 1148, and they were showered with these lavish gifts, plenty of pomp and ceremony put on by a guy called Raymond of Antioch, who had been Prince of Antioch since 1136, and he was also Eleanor's uncle. Now, the historian Dan Jones argues that this was likely a source of comfort for Eleanor, obviously to visit a close family member so far away from her homeland, excuse me, and be present in his exotic court, which wasn't only filled with exotic eastern spices, flowers, animals, but also with these homely additions such as Occitan or Aquitaine speaking men and women from the south and southwest of France. And now, despite only spending 10 days as Raymond's guests in Antioch, it was definitely enough time to create rifts in Eleanor and Louis's marriage. So notwithstanding Raymond's generosity and hospitality, Louis announced that he had no intention of deploying his troops to help increase Raymond's army for the Second Crusade, which was the whole point of him meeting in Antioch. Now, Raymond was obviously furious upon hearing this, and the contemporary chronicler William of Tyre reported that Raymond began to hate Louis's ways. He openly plotted against him and took means to do him injury. Now, to achieve this, Raymond used his relationship with Eleanor to sort of blackmail Louis. Now, this trick did work on Eleanor. She was happy at Raymond's court, and she refused to leave for Jerusalem with her husband, so Louis set off without her. However, the joy was short-lived. As Eleanor remained in Antioch with her uncle, rumours began spreading that they were having an incestuous affair. Now, even if they did have an affair, it wouldn't actually have been incestuous because Raymond was her blood aunt's husband. But nevertheless, it blackened Eleanor's reputation and essentially cuckolded Louis. So William of Tyre wrote that, contrary to her royal dignity, she disregarded her marriage vows and was unfaithful to her husband. But the problem with a statement like this is interpreting this in the 12th century and the 21st century yield very different results. So it was almost certain that William was actually referring to the perceived domestic sin of disobedience, which is straight-edged, sort of churchmen and contemporaries viewed as a sin of equal magnitude compared to sexual infidelity. But nevertheless, the crusade went on without Eleanor and actually culminated in a miserable failure and marked the beginning of the end of Louis and Eleanor's marriage. However, the couple were briefly reconciled at Easter 1149 and then left back home for France, albeit on separate ships. So both ships and couples met up at Sicily before sailing on to Pope Eugene III's villa in Tusculum, which is around in modern-day Frascati, around 12 miles south of Rome. So the Pope attempted to reconcile the couple, even offering them a marital bed draped with fine fabrics, but that failed as well. And within 18 months of the return to France in 1149, Eleanor had already remarried, this time to a young English nobleman called Henry Fitz-Empress. Now, as Queen of England is the next section, so by Aquitaine's law, women, which is quite unusual for the time obviously, could inherit and administer property in their own right, and Eleanor's father had specified that the Duchy of Aquitaine should not be integrated into the royal demesnes, but should instead remain independent and be inherited by Eleanor's heirs, not Eleanor and Louis's heirs. So therefore, when their marriage was annulled in 1152, Eleanor parted from Louis, and her huge inheritance also parted from the French crown. So within the space of a few months, Eleanor married Henry, who was then the Count of Anjou and Maine and Duke of Normandy. 2 years later, he became King of England, and he was crowned as the first Plantagenet monarch, Henry II. So Eleanor's vast territories in the south and southwest of France joined with Henry's and formed the huge Plantagenet Empire, right from Scotland to Spain, as you can see on the map on your screen at the minute. Now, Eleanor had still not escaped crusade, and it was literally in Henry's blood. So his grandfather was a guy called King Fulk of Jerusalem, and he obviously King of Jerusalem, and both of his uncles, Fulk's sons, Baldwin III and Amalric I, were also kings of Jerusalem. So it seemed like a match made in heaven. But despite their prosperous marriage, they had 8 children between them, 5 of whom went on to become kings or queens. It was notoriously fractious too, and this was largely a result of Henry's numerous mistresses, including one who was known as Fair Rosamund, whom Eleanor was actually accused of poisoning to death. But due to Henry's infidelities, Eleanor moved back to Poitiers in France in 1167. So I'll just have a quick sort of excerpt here from, this is sort of her lifestyle and culture in what was known as the Court of Love from 1167 to 73. So during her time back in France, Eleanor founded and established what was called the Court of Love. And this was a court where everything we associate with the high medieval period took place. So chivalry was encouraged, poetry and music were rife, folklore and literature were constructed within its walls. Now, accompanied by her daughter Marie, the court was also focused on courtly love and symbolic ritual that was eagerly lapped up by the writers and musicians of the day. But despite the brief interlude in Eleanor's exciting life thus far, it was soon to take a turn for the worst. So the next section we talk about is rebellion and imprisonment. Excuse me. So, after the crisis between Henry II and Thomas Becket, which you can read about in a different blog post I've written, and obviously listen to the first video, which I'll link below, Eleanor had begun to start stirring rebellions against Henry. So she initially inspired a rebellion from the English Earls Robert of Leicester and Bigod of Norfolk in early 1173, and was actually supported by her ex-husband Louis VII, because obviously anything between England and France, he's going to support French, or anything that undermines the English king. So initially, Henry had managed to quash these rebellions at the expense of generous pardons and financial aid, but by mid-1173 there was one rebellion which tipped Henry over the edge, and this was when his eldest son and heir, young Henry, had fled to France to be with his mother, Eleanor, apparently to plot to seize the throne from his father. Now, Eleanor, rumoured to be actively supporting young Henry's plans against Henry II, was arrested and placed under arrest. She also actually later encouraged Richard, her other son, to pay homage to the King of France, who was Philip II at that time. But, unlike ordinary prisoners, because she was no ordinary prisoner, she was placed under relatively comfortable confinement, which is essentially house arrest, and shuttled between different English castles for the next 16 years. Now, young Henry died of a disease in 1183, allegedly begging for his mother's release on his deathbed, and Henry II actually did release Eleanor on various occasions, and she rejoined his household in 1154 for at least part of each year and accompanied him on these solemn occasions such as funeral processions and so on, as well as resuming some of her ceremonial duties as queen. So, on to her later life and death from 1199 to 1204. So, Henry II died in 1189, leaving the next oldest son, which was Eleanor's favourite, Richard I, as heir. Now, he succeeded his father as Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart. in 1189, and one of his first acts was to release Eleanor completely from house arrest. And she actually went on to rule as regent, Queen Regent, in Richard's absence during his leading of the Third Crusade. So again, another crusade in relation to Eleanor. And even the age in Eleanor's duties were far from over at this point. So aged 70, she managed to negotiate Richard I's release from prison. And then when she was 78, one of her granddaughters, who was called Blanche of Castile, she brought her from Spain to France to wed the King of France, who at that point was Louis VIII. And when she turned 80, she actually directed the defence of a town under siege from an army. So how iconic. Now, when Richard died in 1199, Eleanor actually lived long enough to see her youngest son, who was Henry II's favourite, John, become King of England. And she was even employed by John as an envoy to France, and she later supported John's rule against the rebellion of one of her grandsons called Arthur, and finally retired as a nun to the abbey at Fontevraud. Now, Eleanor peacefully slipped away on the 1st of April 1204, aged between 81 to 82, which is a good age for these times, but for that time it was absolutely immense, and she was buried in that abbey next to her favourite son, Richard. So what legacy did Eleanor leave behind? Well, I think there's few historians who would disagree with the statement that Eleanor was the most influential woman of the Middle Ages. Now, there were numerous kings who did twice as little, but have twice as much written about them, and despite the fact she was a 12th century woman, she arguably had more influence over the people around her than the men did. For example, the historian Norman Davies states that Eleanor of Aquitaine was perhaps the outstanding personality of the age. She made her mark not only as a woman of remarkable spirit, but as a political and cultural patron of immense influence. Now, this is true. So among her children and grandchildren, she lived to see one emperor, 3 kings of England, kings of Jerusalem and Castile, a duke of Brittany, and another queen of France. And despite the attempts of the chroniclers like William of Tyre to stain her reputation as an incestuous whore, and those others who accused her of poisoning fair Rosamund, she nevertheless survived all odds and stands as the central figure in the cultural history of a land in which her enemies were intent on destroying. So I hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks for listening, and like I mentioned earlier, just leave a comment below, let me know what you think about it, give it a like, share, comment, subscribe. Invite your friends to like it. You'll be able to see all my social links underneath. And if you just drop a comment, let me know what you'd want to hear next time. I've got some ideas lined up, but it's always good to have some suggestions. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you next time.